now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has welcomed the decision to accept the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. Now, this comes as world leaders meet in India for the 18th summit of the Group of 20.
Now, among the issues being addressed are agreements on climate financing. You're talking global debt, reform of institutions like the World Bank, and a new Green Development Pact among member states. We are now joined by Elizabeth Sidiropoulos to share her insights on some of the outcomes of the G20 Summit so far. She's, of course, the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Elizabeth, good morning. Let's perhaps start here. The AU had advocated for full membership for 7 years. Until now, of course, South Africa was the bloc's only G20 member. What is the significance of the African Union being included in the G20, and how does it impact Africa's representation on the global stage?
So, good morning, Jenna. It's good to be with you. Well, I think the importance of the AU being a member of the G20 as a full member, because for a number of years now, the AU, as well as the NEPAD high-level implementation, the chair of the NEPAD high-level implementation committee, have participated as observers. And we've also seen over the course of the last day a number of observers who are fairly regular participants in the G20. The importance of it, though, being a full member, is the fact that a lot of the conversations, a lot of the discussions, you've already highlighted some of them, that the G20 engages with, tries to build consensus to take forward into more formal multilateral fora, such as, for example, the COPs that we're having now at the end of this year in the United Arab Emirates. All of these have a significant impact on Africa. If Africa's voice is not at the table, it cannot help to both input onto the agenda, shape the outcome of particular issues, and have the other members understand the particular concerns and priorities of Africa. South Africa certainly has tried to put many of these African concerns and nuances on the agenda, from finance to climate to debt and so on. But it's always better to have a second voice, and certainly one that is representative of the continent. In the past, people have said, well, should we include other African countries? Should we bring in an Egypt or a Nigeria, etc.? Obviously, bringing in the AU is intended to be much more inclusive. It also, I think, reflects the very strong position that India took since the beginning of its presidency to focus on global South issues, to give the global South a voice, even though the global South itself is in many ways quite diverse. But I think this is probably the most direct and concrete outcome of that engagement, among others.
In fact, Elizabeth, let's pick up on that. I mean, Africa is a very diverse continent with varying political and economic situations, with more than 1 billion people. That's a significant number in as far as the population of a people is concerned. And how can the AU ensure that its participation in the G20 adequately represents the interests of all African nations?
This is going to be, of course, the difficulty. The AU, of course, itself is an intergovernmental organization. It's a little different from the European Union, which is also and has been since the inception a member of the G20. So there are two issues here that I think, as we move forward as a continent to be a full member of the G20, that we need to focus on. The first is clearly how do we make sure that the representatives of the AU, which in this instance will be the Commission President as well as the rotating chair, which is an annual appointment, so that itself can be quite challenging. How do we ensure that they have a mandate to engage in the various discussions? There are over 200 meetings every year at ministerial level, at working group level, and of course culminating in the summit. How do we make sure that the representatives of the AU in all of these forums have been given an adequate mandate, whether it's on health and security, on the intersect with climate, on finance, on debt, and the list goes on. That's going to require a mechanism and a process on an ongoing basis that tries at least to build common positions on certain issues. It's not going to be on everything, but it's on certain issues. So that's the first point. And the second point, of course, relates to making sure that the AU itself, the Commission in particular, builds up significant technical capacity. You almost want them to establish a self-standing unit within the AU in Addis Ababa that can actually work on an ongoing basis on the variety of G20 issues that it's going to cover. And lastly, I just want to come back to the point about the rotating presidency. Clearly, in the South African case, we're a permanent member. We have people in our various ministries, in DIRCO, in Treasury, etc., working on G20 issues. Other countries that are not members wouldn't necessarily set up their own units within their various ministries, if they're rotating every so many years. So how we help both South Africa as well as I think the various African continental institutions, how do we ensure that the rotating chair has adequate support, as well as the AU Commission, in order to participate in what are often very technical discussions, but clearly also take on a political dimension.
Listening to you, it's clear, Elizabeth, that there is still some technical details that we as Africa would need to iron out to be able to really use our voice effectively at this table. But as citizens, sometimes we watch these summits and it kind of goes over our heads. We don't pay attention to the details of the discussions at the summit. How do the decisions taken at the G20 summit influence the lives of everyday South Africans, and why should we at all take interest in these decisions?
Well, that's a very good question. Firstly, I think it's important to point out that the G20 decide on the declaration, which was issued yesterday by consensus. So it's not about voting. It is really ensuring that everybody's on the same page, which is why it was a fraught few days in the run-up to the summit to see whether, in fact, there would be a declaration because of the wording around the Ukraine war. I think the G20 itself doesn't implement things at the global level, so to speak, right? All of these countries are there representing themselves. If you look at the declaration, a lot of them are voluntary, agreements, so to speak. The idea then is to take many of these, for example, on how we deal with debt, which is a big issue for South Africa and for Africa. How we scale up financing for sustainable development, how we make sure that the various institutions actually move forward in a way that the G20 has agreed should happen. So, increasing the financing of the World Bank for SDG-related issues, or changing the way in which climate finance is given to countries, more concessional loans and so on and so forth. And a lot of those are in the document. And so the relevance for this, for South Africans and indeed for other Africans, is that if these actions are then taken forward and adopted, whether it's at the UN, at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, or at the COP28 that's coming up at the end of this year, we will see an impact on the way in which developing countries across the board may be able to deal, for example, with the really bad consequences of climate change in terms of floods, droughts, and so on, or to free up the ability of states to invest in more education and health outcomes if they are not having to pay sometimes more than a fifth of their overall national budget towards servicing their debt. As things stand on the debt issue at the moment, many African countries spend more on servicing their debt, largely as a result of the pandemic and then the negative consequences of the war in Ukraine, than they're able to spend on health and education. So in an indirect, I suppose in a very direct way, the decisions, the consensus built at the G20 can help to move and unblock problems at the global level that have a really big impact on national economies, and particularly on sustainable development, implementation and acceleration of sustainable development goals, ability to borrow through the multilateral development banks concessionally, and so on and so forth.
In fact, just on that, Elizabeth, then I must absolutely ask you this. I mean, what do you believe was the rationale behind the Group of 20's decision to adopt a consensus declaration that refrained from condemning Russia for its actions in Ukraine and instead emphasized the importance of all states refraining from using force to acquire territory? I mean, we know President Putin was not at the summit, and Ukraine is not impressed with the declaration as it pertains to Russia's invasion.
Yeah, so this was always going to be the point of contention, and we also saw this emerge at the summit in Bali last year when Indonesia was chairing. In fact, for most of the time, for most of the meetings that even Indonesia held, so the various ministerials and so on, they weren't actually able to issue a declaration out of each of the ministerials, because there wasn't agreement on the wording around that. So what was issued was a chair's notes and summaries of the discussion. But coming together at the Bali summit, both the Indians and the Indonesians worked really hard on making sure that the language there was acceptable. But there it was much stronger than it was here today. And I think, or yesterday, I think the Indians certainly expended a lot of effort in making sure that there was a consensus document, because at the end of the day, the Ukraine war is a serious matter. It is a violation of the UN Charter on Territorial Integrity, Sovereignty, and so on, as the declaration does set out, but not directly. But there are also, and this has been the position of India throughout this, and many other countries, including South Africa, throughout the year, that the G20 is not the forum for peace and security issues, largely. That the G20 is the forum for coming together on critical global economic governance issues. That's the way in which it was first created at a summit level in 2008, was to deal with the financial crisis. And there are other many so many important issues, particularly for developing countries, that if we allow the Ukraine war and sort of bickering over wording to sort of overcome everything else, we're really losing sight of the bigger picture. And so I think there was compromise on both sides right up until the end. There was back and forth. Obviously, the G7 members feel quite strongly about certain wording. The Chinese and the Russians were not actually going to sign, from what we heard over the course of the last week, and that there was a great deal of diplomatic effort from the Indians to arrive at a wording that everybody could agree on, so that we could have a declaration, because we also have to look at the bigger picture.
Now, there was quite a lot of developments. China's President Xi Jinping, of course, did not attend the summit, and that, of course, led to some speculation whether there is some tension between China and India. Unfortunately, we won't have time to look at that now, because I want us, for the last minute, to just examine the leaders' declaration that they were able to reach an issue. Just within a minute, perhaps, what are some of the key points that are noteworthy, according to you, for our viewers?
Okay, so it was a fairly lengthy document. It covered a lot of issues. I think from the perspective of South Africa and Africa, critically, the issue around the economy, around managing the sort of the challenges, the macroeconomic challenges around inflation that we have seen over the last couple of years, the issue and the statement, the strong statement around unblocking energy, unblocking foods, the grain initiative in the Black Sea. I think that was very important. Another element, of course, is the debt. There have been some very positive initiatives from the Indian presidency around making sure that the countries who are highly indebted can move more quickly on an agreement with their creditors. And then, of course, I think a really useful important focus on gender equality and empowerment, and how we scale up and make the digital economy work for the poor. And here India really profiled and highlighted its own initiatives in setting up digital public infrastructure. And I think there are a lot of opportunities there, particularly for African countries in that regard. And perhaps lastly, I should say, the commitment really to improve and scale up the ability of multilateral development banks to provide finance. And it was useful to see the discussion between India, South Africa, Brazil, which are the next chairs of the G20, the American president and the president of the World Bank on that very issue on the sidelines of the summit.